All right. Good evening, and thank you for attending our Iowa History Book Club tonight. We are so glad that you're here virtually, of course. My name is Andrew Klumpp, and I am the editor of the Annals of Iowa here at the State Historical Society of Iowa. Every quarter, the State Historical Society hosts a book club during which we hear from authors and historians and discuss all periods and areas of Iowa history and often Midwestern history, as you'll hear about tonight. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each book club meeting you'd like to attend. We have a link in the chat, but we're glad you're here tonight, and we hope you'll join us again in the future. Today, we are kicking off our 2023 Iowa History Book Club series and celebrating Iowa History Month for one more day by being joined by my good friend, Jon Lauck, to talk about his book, The Good Country. A few housekeeping things before we get started, and I introduce our speaker in earnest. One is that closed captioning is available. It's going to be down on the bar at the lower end of your screen. So if you'd like to use that, you can go ahead and use those. We can also look forward to a Q&A session with Jon at the end of the conversation. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time in the evening. If you've got one now, go ahead and drop it in. And some of you even sent them ahead of time, and that's great. My colleague, Jennifer Cooley, and I will receive what you put into that Q&A feature, and we'll be able to pose those questions to Jon later in the evening. Though, please note, if there's a lot of them, we may not get to everything, but we'll do our very best to get to all your questions. And then finally, by participating in this book club, you agree to engage respectfully with the presenter and the hosts and anybody else who's participating in the webinar. Any harassing or disruptive behavior, and that includes in the chat, is prohibited. All right. And with that, I am really pleased to introduce my friend and our guest tonight, Jon Lauck. Jon is the founding president of the Midwestern History Association, and he is also the managing editor, or the editor-in-chief, of the Middle West Review. He's taught at the University of South Dakota, lives in Sioux Falls. He's the author of several books, the editor of many books. One of those books was kind of kicked off the field, or the new attention of the field of Midwestern history, which was The Lost Region, toward a revival of Midwestern history, which was published in 2013. But we're here tonight to talk about his most recent book, The Good Country, which in many ways picks up on what really is, Jon, a decade or more of your work, or a lot of your career. And so we're just thrilled to have you here and looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Andrew. Always a pleasure. And I should point out that I'm in my basement in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is probably about 3 miles from the Iowa border. When we want to get some outdoor recreation, we go over to the Big Sioux River Valley, the river that divides northwest Iowa and southeast South Dakota. There's a recent book out about that river called Heartland River. And I know there's a lot of people in Northwest Iowa who took great interest in that. And there's some pretty active historical societies down along the river, like in Hawarden, for example. So thank you for having me tonight, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks. We're glad to have you here. Hawarden, also the hometown of our lieutenant governor here in Iowa. So there's some folks, some people who are big names in the state who come from that region. I say as someone who grew up in Northwest Iowa too, right? I'm hardly as important. So I thought we would get started tonight, Jon, just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what sparked your interest in this topic and how you actually decided to pursue writing this book. And I know that's kind of a big question because this has been such a big part of really your work for the last decade or so on the field of Midwestern history. So feel free to take us back as far as you want in answering that question, but how do we get to The Good Country?
Well, let me connect in Hawarden here a little bit. Hawarden, in addition to being the home of your lieutenant governor, is also the home, or was the home, of a novelist by the name of Ruth Succo. And Ruth Succo was a very big deal in the teens and 20s and even into the 1930s in this country. She was a representative of cultural regionalism or literary regionalism, or the movement that existed to put the Midwest on the map culturally and to exert some strength culturally and to push back against the coastal domination of the culture. And I'm a big fan of regionalism and the regionalist movement. There is an outstanding book, and I think it's one of the pillars of the study of Midwestern studies, and it is called Kinship with the Land. It was published by University of Iowa Press probably 30 years ago, and it's about the regionalist movement in Iowa. And it was written by a guy who grew up in a little town in Iowa, but he went off to do fancy things in the world and became a professor at University of Southern California, became an expert in Latin American history. But toward the end of his life, he wanted to return home and write about Iowa. And he wrote this book about the regionalist movement in the state of Iowa. And that impulse to plant your flag and talk about your region and make sure your region is part of the national conversation is a big part of why I started this project. The more specific origins, Andrew, has to do with a class I was teaching about an hour from here up north on the interstate at South Dakota State University, national football champions, by the way. Teaching a course there. At the last minute, the head of the department said, you got to teach South Dakota history, which I'm sure a lot of colleges in Iowa have courses in Iowa history, and there are high school classes dedicated to Iowa history. And this course I was teaching was kind of designed for future teachers in South Dakota. Anyway, long story short, I just realized there's really not much written about the founding of South Dakota. So I did a book on it called Prairie Republic, about the Great Dakota Boom and the early settlement of the state. Well, I noticed all these people coming in, like 90% of the people who were non-immigrants were coming from the Midwest, including a huge chunk from Iowa and people from Wisconsin. I grew up on a farm south of the town of Madison, South Dakota, named by Wisconsin settlers for Madison, Wisconsin. My grandfather grew up in Johnson County out in Oxford, Iowa, and here right after World War I to try and find a farm because obviously, South Dakota is less populated than Iowa, and a lot of people moved west to find their fortune. The Laucks actually came in the 1880s during the Dakota boom that I was talking about. So anyway, I was trying to come up with a way to explain to people why these settlers being from the Midwest was important. So naturally, what I would do is turn to all the standard books on the history of the Midwest and what the Midwest was like and what's its DNA, et cetera. Well, what I found out very quickly, to make a long story short, is that there wasn't much written about the Midwest. And so I started doing all this historiographical digging, meaning historiography is just kind of the study of how historians do their work and the books they've written and what the patterns are in their research and writing. And what I discovered was basically it was a barren field. And I spun all this out into a book that you mentioned called The Lost Regions Toward a Revival of Midwestern History, which came out 10 years ago in 2013. And we had some conferences and conference panels about it. That's what historians do. They get together at conferences and have talks and try and get a discussion going. And we ended up forming a new organization called the Midwestern History Association to try and advance the field and get the story of the Midwest back into the conversation about American history, where it had disappeared from.
Yeah, that's great. And it's so helpful to hear about how this book really fits into a larger story that you've been telling, a larger project that you've been working on, because then we can read this book in its context, really, which I think is where it shines, right, as kind of a culmination of a larger project. What makes this book distinct? What is the project? What's the story you're telling here? And how does that fit into that larger effort that you've been pursuing to revive the field of Midwestern history?
Well, here is the book, and I want to talk about one thing related to this book, and that is the cover. Before I get into kind of how this came together, I was reading the Omaha Omaha World News, or Omaha World Herald, I should say, a couple of years ago, and there was a story in there about a farm couple in the middle of Nebraska who were very interested in art, agrarian art. And this is the kind of art that Grant Wood, since I'm talking to Iowans, the kind of paintings that he used to do. But this nice old couple in Nebraska had been collecting these paintings for 70 years, and they were getting old, and they decided to donate them to the art museum at the University of Nebraska. And so the newspaper wrote a big story about it. And their name was the Mosmans, Moseman. And so the Mosman art collection is now in Nebraska. And I emailed them and I said, some of these paintings are absolutely amazing. Can I use one for the cover of my book? And they were very happy to share one. So that is the backstory on the cover of the book. But of course, Iowans are spoiled on this front. They have lots of access to Grant Wood and other painters. Up in South Dakota, we have Harvey Dunn. That's kind of that's kind of the poor man's Grant Wood. But so back to your question, how does this fit into the overall field? Well, as I said, there just wasn't much done on Midwestern history. And I thought, in order for other professors and other high school teachers and everyone else to sort of begin this conversation, they need a book that they can assign in a class. So let's say you're teaching a class on the history of the Midwest at Drake next semester, Andrew. You need a book to assign to the kids so they can get a sense of the field and what the major questions are and what the major topics are. And that simply did not exist. So I kind of foolishly said, well, I'll write that history. That's not that complicated. Well, writing a big, large-scale history of a region was much more complicated than I thought. And when I began, I thought, well, I'm going to go from 1800 to the present. This is going to be a big picture survey. And by the time I got deep into the 19th century, I was like, there's no way. I mean, I cannot squeeze all this in. So I ended up making it a book about the Midwest writ large, but focused on the 19th century. So roughly 1800 to 1900. 1800 is an obvious beginning point because that's essentially when the state of Ohio is created and organized. And that's a good beginning point. And you get to the end of the 19th century, things begin to change a lot in the Midwest with the coming of industrialization and urbanization and the radio and mechanization of farms, et cetera. You kind of enter a new era in the beginning of the 20th century, to the world wars, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Someone needs to do that book next. That's an obvious next step. The modern age and the Midwest, that would be an outstanding project. Hopefully there's some young scholar listening who tackles this. But this book is about the 19th century Midwest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love, and I think it's helpful for listeners too, to hear kind of the scope and the goal, right? Who is that intended audience? That classroom, right? It helps us to understand what the goals and you were trying to accomplish with the book are. And I wonder, since you mentioned kind of some of the parts of the Midwest, the question I would have, right? Is it a conversation about the Midwest if we don't ask the question of how you define the Midwest? It comes up in every conversation. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit for our listeners and those who are here and who've read the book or will read the book. How do you think about and define the Midwest? What was determining what that was for this project? Since it seems like people want to debate, what is and isn't the Midwest.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fun discussion and it's a good discussion. I think we can get very close to the correct answer. I mean, there's going to be a little debate around the edges, but the Midwest is roughly the 12 states that are defined as the Midwest in the US Census. So Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. I think that's 12. Now, that's a simple answer, and that's a good working definition, and that's where you should start. However, you need to take the next step and begin to refine that down a little bit. Iowa has the luxury of being completely in the Midwest. If there's a state that's the capital of the Midwest, it's Iowa. There's actually a great survey done by some pollsters a couple of years ago where they were asking people, well, do you consider yourself in the Midwest? And of course, it's off the charts in Iowa. But in other states that are along the border, it's a little more complicated. So I'm in South Dakota. Let's take that as an example. I'm up against the Iowa border in South Dakota, East River, as they call it, or the section of the state that's east of the Missouri River. That's very Midwestern. It's very Iowa and Minnesota centric. However, once you cross the Missouri River, that becomes kind of the plains west. It becomes short grass country, a lot more ranching. You have a lot more Indian reservations, a lot more mountains, different topography. The land is more arid. This is where you've crossed this line where the annual precipitation drops below 20 inches. And so things are drier and different out there as opposed to the more well-watered Midwest. So that's an important clarification that people need to keep in mind. Now, there's a great book about that boundary called The Interior Borderlands. I think the subtitle is Essays on the Great Plains and Midwest or something like that. But if you want to think about it, think about the Missouri River or the 100th meridian. That's a good dividing point. Now let's go over to the east. So once you cross the Appalachians and you're kind of off out of those Appalachian valleys and into what I would consider east central Ohio, that's definitely the beginning of the Midwest. If you get to the center of Ohio, like Columbus, very Midwestern. Now, on that eastern side, where it's very Appalachia-ish, around Youngstown, where that train wreck happened a couple of months ago, that is kind of oriented toward Pennsylvania and Appalachia, and it's a little bit different zone. That's that zone where that Ohio senator is from, who wrote Hillbilly Elegy. So a little different area. Now, on the southern edge of the Midwest, you have the Ohio River, which is a very good dividing point. But those southern counties in the Midwest, in Midwestern states that abut the Ohio River, they're very mixed at best and even a little southernish. For example, if you look at a map, look at how far down the state of Illinois juts into the south. If you go down to that town at the tip of Illinois on the south, Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio River and the Mississippi River come together, that town is further south than Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. So that's pretty southern. And so too with those southern tier of counties in Indiana and Ohio. So, I mean, these aren't strict lines. They're not stark lines, but you can, and even in Iowa a little bit. I mean, I lived in Iowa City for 4 years, and we, did a fair amount of touring around Iowa. I mean, that southern tier of counties next to Missouri, it's a little different than the Dutch country that you're from, Andrew. And of course, Missouri is like this mixed zone. And, some people think of Missouri as the South. Some people think of it as the Midwest, and there are different parts of it. I mean, since we're talking about a research agenda in the future, it's my goal to do one of these edited collections on where does the Midwest end and where does the South begin, I think it would be a great discussion, because Southern history is a huge field. There would be a ton of experts to draw on it.
Mhm.
Now, can I make I'm going to throw out one last thing, which is kind of fun. This is a fun announcement. Andrew and I go to this great conference every May in Michigan called the Midwestern History Association Conference. It's free. So any of you who want to go, drive out to Grand Rapids. It's a beautiful city, and join us and join our cause. We need more people to help out. And I know there are lots of librarians and graduate students and teachers and retired teachers listening. You can help us out. We need more boots on the ground, so to speak. Anyway, back to this conference. We're going to be at this conference, Andrew and I, and we are going to release or launch into the world a new book called North Country, Essays on the Northern Borderlands of the Midwest, or something like that. It's coming out from University of Oklahoma Press, and it has, I think, the most stunning cover I've ever seen. Certainly the most stunning cover I've ever been associated with. Many of you folks, I'm sure, have gone up to Lake Superior, driven along the North Shore, and seen Split Rock Lighthouse out there. Well, this picture is a picture of Split Rock, but with the northern lights shining in the background. And I don't know what it's been like in Iowa, but up here in South Dakota, the northern lights have been crazy the last couple of weeks. And there's been lots of northern lights watchers going out to this. I mean, normally that's up in Manitoba or higher that you got to go to see those. But anyway, that book, North Country, will describe this slice of the Midwest that's a little bit different. You have the core farm country of Iowa, but then you have that tier of places of the Midwest where you got Duluth and Thunder Bay, and you have the Iron Range and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Very cool places. I love these places. But it's a little bit different flavor. There's a lot of sub-regional variation in the Midwest. And that's one of the fun things about the field, is finding out these little pockets of different ethnicities, different topography, different culture, different history. Of course, I mentioned Andrew's from the famous Dutch country of Western Iowa. I was talking today with Kathy Kanzen at the University of Chicago. She has mapped out and studied these German counties in central Minnesota, Stearns County, etc. So that's another great pocket. Those Appalachian pockets of Ohio, of course. There's a new book I was reading last week about Polish Chicago. I mean, there's so many fun little subplots to Midwestern history that need to be studied. And, we want to be careful when we're trying to explore all the various subtopics in this field, that we don't flatten out the Midwest and lose those little subcultures that are important to the region.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I'm by trade a historian of immigrant communities as well. So I study one of those pockets in a lot of my own work. So I want to pick up a thread. You mentioned that Iowa, kind of could be the capital of the Midwest, or the center part. And I wonder, this is Iowa History Book Club. So I have to ask, what role then does that mean that Iowa plays in the Midwest, or how does or doesn't it fit in the region? How should we as Iowans think about our place in Midwestern history?
Well, I would think of it this way. I mentioned to you these peripheral boundary areas of the Midwest, the 100th meridian, central Missouri, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Appalachian, Ohio. So those are the boundaries. But in the dead center, you have this core Midwestern culture of small towns, rural areas, farming, etc. Now, as time marched along, there was more industry and there were bigger cities, etc. But for my period of time in this book, this is farm country and small towns. And, that's what Iowa is. And it's right in the middle. And so it's a perfect representation of this core zone of the Midwest. And I think, you're lucky in a sense. You have some good histories of the state. In fact, a South Dakotan, Dorothy Schweeder, I'm sure many of your listeners know, she grew up in Presho, South Dakota. Speaking of these boundary lines, Presho, South Dakota is really on this line, maybe slightly to the west of the 100th meridian. She ended up living in Iowa and doing lots of studies of Iowa history. She wrote a book about those famous coal mining towns that the name has escaped, Bluffton, or I'm sure you
Buxton.
Buxton, yeah. And anyway, she wrote a great history of Iowa that came out maybe 20 years ago. And I don't know if I'm supposed to say this or not, but a little hot tip here for Iowans. There's a new history of Iowa that should be out this fall from University Press of Kansas. So that's exciting too. And there was a good history written of Iowa by a fellow. It came out during the bicentennial, so that would have been 1976. And I think he was a professor at maybe Iowa State. I can't.
Yeah, there were a couple at the time. There's Joseph Wall's History of Iowa, but also Leland Sage. Wall was a part of a bicentennial effort of writing histories, but Sage's is often the one that people go to. Slightly more recent. I think 78 was Sage's.
One thing I wanted to mention about Iowa, and this is sad news in my book, because the 19th century Iowa that I study is made up of small towns and farms. And one of the first institutions that gets built in an Iowa town, as I describe in the book, is a church. In addition to Main Street and a hardware store and a school, and very soon after that, a college. And I don't know what the breakdown is in Iowa these days, but Iowa, the biggest religious denomination used to be Methodist, meaning the Wesleyan had the biggest church. And I mention this because there was some grim news this week about the closing of Iowa Wesleyan University down in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Well, this would have been one of those first institutions built by those early Iowans that I describe in the book. And it wasn't just Iowa Wesleyan that they built, but they built other colleges like Grinnell, et cetera. I mean, these were very much Wartburg and the Dutch colleges in the Northeast or in the Northwest, like Northwestern and Dort. These all come out of these religiously active settlers who came out in the 19th century. And this college, Iowa Wesleyan, is almost 200 years old. That's pretty amazing. When you can say something is 200 years old in our country, that's going back to the beginnings. So very sad to hear that news, but this is a major feature of Iowa history, and this is one of the leading archetypal institutions that these people were building in the 19th.
Yeah, so the era you're studying really is institution building and those establishing these things that many are still here today. But yeah, as you say, that many are also on their sometimes being closed or falling away. I wonder, we're at about 7:30, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll switch into questions from the audience. So if you have questions and you haven't submitted them yet, please drop those in the Q&A. We will try to get to as many of them as we can. So go ahead and do that, and we'll read those off as they come. But I wondered, Jon, you mentioned like the broader vision you had for this book originally to go all the way to the present. And so I guess with the benefit of a little bit of hindsight, the book is still relatively, new, but is there anything that you would change about the book, or anything you wish, like, oh, I found this out since then, or I saw this, I wish I had included it? What is there anything you'd change, or anything you wish you had the space or time to include?
Oh gosh, Andrew, there's so many things I'd love to. I mean, it was, I think, one of the most difficult parts of this book is drawing some boundaries and parameters and trying to corral all this information, because I think I say this in the beginning of the book, that I felt like I should have done more to explain how rural and how agriculturally oriented these places were for decades and decades. But I kind of like boiled it down to a couple paragraphs, because I'm like, I don't want to lose readers here by going into every single detail about 19th century farming. But I try to trust people. Look, you got to pay attention to this fact. Most of these people were farming, and the people who weren't were in little towns doing jobs related to farming. And hopefully I was able to convey that effectively. But again, you always run the risk, if you beat a dead horse too much, people are going to lose interest. I'm actually reading a book right now. I keep thinking to myself, because when you're reading a book, you always think, would I have done it this way? And I keep thinking, reading this book, I get the point, guy. Move on to something else. You're bogging down. So that's one thing I would say. Another thing, well, let's put it this way. Ask me in 6 months, because I think the academic reviews are going to be coming very soon. And at the Midwestern History Association conference, we're going to have a panel. And I think there's a voice or two on that panel who, doesn't really love my interpretation of these things. And in the fall, the Northern Great Plains History Conference will have another panel discussion about the book. And the Northern Great Plains History Conference is where this whole project kicked off, by the way. We were meeting in Hudson, Wisconsin, which is not the Northern Great Plains, but before we created the Midwestern History Association, there was no place for Midwestern historians to meet. So they would kind of grab a room at the Great Plains History meeting, which is an odd thing. I'm glad we got our own place to, present our own papers specifically about our region. Anyway, there are a lot of reviews online. If readers want to just Google the name of the book, there'll be a bunch of reviews that pop up, and they can see if they agree with the reviewers about what's been left in or what's been left out, and whether I did a good job. But I think we're in the beginning stages of having that discussion.
Yeah, I find with academic books, a lot of times it takes a while to begin to see where the conversation goes, and maybe see what needed to be added, or where the next stages of the project are. So you kind of answered this question earlier, but this was a question that was sent in ahead of time. One of the audience members wondered about your decision to go with the 19th century rather than a period more like 1850 to 1950. They thought, that when they thought of the Midwestern century, they gravitated toward that slightly later period. And what would you say about your choice of period versus maybe some of the other alternatives you had available to you?
Well, I think I included the early section because that's the beginning of the region. I mean, prior to the Northwest Ordinance being adopted, there really wasn't a Midwest. Prior to the Revolutionary War, all the colonies were along the eastern seaboard. As it turned out, because of the Revolution, we ended up with this big territory in the interior, but nothing really happened with it for a decade or so. And, it starts to take shape in 1803 when Ohio becomes a state and they adopt a constitution, and they kind of make rules like basic statutory laws, and they begin to decide how the whole region will be shaped, because a lot of those Ohioans will end up a generation or two later in Indiana or Michigan or whatever, because it's kind of a east to west process. So I thought I would start at the beginning. And I think these beginning moments of these Midwestern states are critical to understand, because what groups settled the state, what decisions they made at their constitutional conventions, what institutions they first set up when they got to their states. I mean, this determines the future structure and DNA of the state. So it would have been hard to untangle that earlier stage from a later stage, because, you know, I think other people would have came in and said, wait a minute, why didn't you explain where all this came from? Why are you starting in 1850? Now, I will say, in defense of, or in sympathy with the person asking the question, things do begin to change, take on a new urgency, I guess is the right way to say it, in around 1850, because the Midwest, which has always been different than the South, keep that in mind, but the divergence between the regions really becomes dramatic in the 1850s, and you really reach a crisis point after that decade is over. But with the, you know, Fugitive Slave Act, with Dred Scott, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, more than anything, there is a splintering, a deep division between these regions. And, you know, the South holds in there because they kind of control the federal government for much of this time. But when they lose control in 1860, when a Midwesterner is elected president in the form of Abraham Lincoln, and all of a sudden he has the support of all these Midwestern states that are anti-slavery and opposed to what the South is doing, the South leaves. They secede. And so understanding these regional divisions and how stark they were and how they reached crisis proportions in the 1850s is really important to understanding this history. And it's very important that we do not lose sight of it. I was reading, I'm sure lots of your people have heard of Frederick Jackson Turner, and you know about his famous thesis about how the frontier shaped American history. What most people don't know is that Frederick Jackson Turner, a product of Portage, Wisconsin, actually spent most of his life focusing on regions and the history of regions in the United States and how they diverged and were different. And he never really finished his big scale project on American regions. But this explains a lot of Midwestern history. And, you know, the frontier thesis was fine and all, but it was kind of a one-off. He focused most of his life on other things. So anyway, I hope that answered the question. I mean, it's not an arbitrary decision, but, you know, you have to draw a line somewhere. You have to decide where to begin and where to end and what to leave in and what to leave out. And it's always an imperfect solution.
I wonder, and maybe this is a bit of the chair's privilege, if you will, you know, but how would you, you know, I'm thinking about, you mentioned when the Midwest, I always think about in Indigenous history, or in Iowa, we talk a lot about Dubuque and some of the earlier, you know, so how did you maybe, you know, the other side of that question is why not go earlier, right? Because is the starting, I guess I'm trying to trying to put a finger on more precisely, it's the start of the settlement by the United States as a nation, right? You know, that we're looking at more than, I get, my question is not as articulate as it could be, right? But I'm thinking about the opposite of, instead of 1850 to 1950, what about 1700 to, you know, as an earlier period, right? I don't know.
I you're saying, and a couple of things. First, I mean, there really isn't an American Midwest until about 1800, because prior to that, you know, it's controlled by the British, it's controlled by the French. A lot of it is controlled by the Spanish for a while. So it isn't even the United States until much later. So that's one. And, you know, the purpose of the book is to focus on the American Midwest. Now, what is different is the physical space that later becomes the American Midwest. And there's tons of important and amazing history that takes place there. Now, it's not American Midwestern history, at least as I see it, because that's not even a thing until many years later. I will say this: one of my favorite areas of reading, I haven't done lots of original research in this area, but is what's going on in this physical space that later becomes the Midwest from 1600 to 1800. I mean, the Native American history, this huge war between the Huron and the Iroquois. I mean, this is an unbelievable battle that takes place really before the Europeans even get involved. But then after that, you have this battle between, the world's two strongest empires, France and Great Britain. I mean, I can't get enough of the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's amazing to me. In fact, I'm going to show this to you guys up on my wall there. You will see the famous scene of General Wolfe on the Plains of Abraham, where he's fighting the French army during the 7 Years' War. And because of that, the British end up in control of what will become the Midwest and Canada. It's a great history. I love it. But I see it as the prehistory of the Midwest, because the Midwest doesn't even exist yet. Mm-hmm. It has influence because of what those wars did in terms of the Native American tribes and where they ended up and where they migrated. It has impact on because choices were made about where to set up forts in early towns like Detroit and not even Chicago doesn't even count. Chicago comes in the 19th century, but places like Detroit would certainly be true, and Duluth, Prairie du Chien, etc. But I don't want to slight that earlier history because I find it fascinating, and I'm sure many of your listeners and readers would love to dig into that. One book I would highlight that people should start with, and it's a tough book to read because it's deep and complicated and complex, but Richard White, the famous historian who just retired from Stanford, one of his early jobs was teaching at Michigan State University. And since he was in Michigan, he decided to kind of dig around and do Native American history in Michigan. And he ended up writing this book called The Middle Ground. And this is about the relations between the French Empire and the Native Americans in this region that would later become the Midwest. From 1650 to 1750. Of course, the French lose it to the British, and then the Americans come sometime after that. But Richard White, by the way, I really owe a great debt of gratitude, because when I published The Lost Region, this book trying to get people to pay more attention to the Midwest, he was the main reader of it for the University of Iowa Press, and I'm sure that had a major influence on their decision to take the book. So shout out to Richard White.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've got some more questions here. One of them comes in and the person asks, says, I really appreciate the vast section of endnotes that offer so much more on every topic. I'll say that I use your endnotes all the time to get me going on something if I need to find out more. This person says, by their count, there were 1,600 endnotes, most citing multiple secondary sources. So the question is, given that, how do you say then that this is a neglected field? Like, how does all of that material then square with the larger neglected nature of the field, or that perception?
Well, a lot of those sources would come out of old state journals, which are absolutely essential. They're the bone and sinew of our field, such as Annals of Iowa, which is run by Andrew Klumpp here. But the Annals of Iowa goes back a century or more, sometime into the late 1800s. And you can go back there and find articles, but they're about Iowa. They're not about the region. And what needed to be done is you got to cull all this information about different states and then try and make some sort of regional conclusion about it. So I understand what the person is saying, but a lot of those sources are very state specific, or even less, smaller parts of states or towns or whatever. And spooling that all up into something that you can say about the region is much more complicated. But it's a process that it's a building process. And I'm glad to say that here you say you look at the notes, because this is definitely one of the purposes of the book, is to give people a roadmap. I think I say sometimes in the book, or maybe I just thought this, I don't know if it made it into print, but sometimes each one of these pages that is in the book, it could be a book in itself. And this is the struggle a historian always has, is being too micro-focused as opposed to, taking a wider angle lens, which I think most general readers want. They want the broader lens so they can get a sense of the proportions and the big picture. And then if there's something that really piques their interest, then they can drill down into that. And, I hope it yields future research and future books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something I think about a lot as a journal editor, and I know my predecessor did as well, about the relationship between doing state history and larger regional, national, and international history, right? That how does state history fit into all those things? And I could talk about this all night, so I will take a pause, and you can move to the next question when you're back. But yeah, it's an interesting question of the relationship between state and regional approaches. The next question we've got here tonight says, back when I was in college decades ago, one of the ecology instructors I had said that Adair, Iowa was about the rough start of the Great Plains. And then it says, why would that place be instead of, say, Nebraska? So is there any case to be made for other places kind of beginning the start of the Great Plains?
All right, I'm going to write this down, Adair, but I want to address a point you just made there about struggling as a journal editor. Your predecessor, Marv Bergman, and I would talk in Iowa City many moons ago about this issue. And he actually brought up to the board of Annals of Iowa, maybe Annals of Iowa should be a regional journal. Maybe we should focus on the Midwest instead of just Iowa, because, as he said, there is no journal that focuses on Midwestern history as a region. And I think he got the response from the board of directors that, well, we're supposed to be here studying Iowa history, so that's what we're going to keep as our mission, which is a very logical and rational response. I understand what they're saying. However, one of the consequences of that is a lot of history that's done in the Midwest is siloed into state-specific stories. Whereas some of these stories are definitely regional stories. The farm crisis of the 80s, that's a regional thing. It didn't just happen in Iowa. And farming practices or the populist movement or whatever. These are regional stories. But you're based in Iowa, and the state of Iowa pays your bills. And so they want people to focus on Iowa, which makes perfect sense again. But it also is a rationale for us to begin a journal focused on the Midwest as a region. And that's what we did in 2014 when we launched Middle West Review, which is what I was scrambling around here for a minute. I was trying to find a copy of it to show up, but I don't be playing here. But it is a struggle. I'm sure you get article submissions and you're thinking, well, this is interesting Iowa story, but it's really the regional story. Am I doing a disservice to the context and to the larger historical enterprise by not making this more of a regional thing. So the struggle is real. I understand where everybody's coming from on that, but hopefully Middle West Review helps to solve that problem a little bit by widening the lens into the region as a whole. Okay, back to Adair. Well, I mean, there's different ways of deciding what is the plains, the prairie plains. And some people say that, you know, the prairie plains begins in places like Adair because this is a place of tall grass prairie. Now, another very important division or distinction could be made by where the beginning of the short grass prairie plains begins. And that's what I've done. That's why I use the 100th meridian as roughly my dividing point. But again, it all depends on what grasses you choose and what particular time period, because there will be migration of these lines over time. There's a professor at Iowa State University who studies prairie fires, and her name is, I'm blanking at the moment, but she does a lot.
Julie Courtwright.
Yes, Julie Courtwright. And she has a book, I think it's her book about prairie fires. And she talks in there a lot about, you know, where we draw these lines. Should it be tall grass prairie? Should it be short grass prairie? Should it be somewhere in between? Should it be moisture levels? And some of the old geography books have these lines where they will trace out, you know, various ways of looking at the Midwest. So I'm not saying this person's geography teacher was wrong about Adair. I'm just saying there's different ways of looking at it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, it's growing up I grew up in Northwest Iowa, and I always felt like we were closer to, you know, getting closer to the Great Plains than maybe when we would travel east to other parts of Iowa. You know, there's a big difference between Northwest Iowa, say, and even Eastern Iowa. So yeah, a lot of it depends on what you want to use as your definition. So then the next question I've got here says, how did you choose what to include about Native Americans in Iowa and the Midwest when also addressing the mass settlement of Easterners and European groups? So how did you do that balance there between Indigenous people and then those who were coming to settle from elsewhere?
Well, I try to explain and give people some entry points into the whole discussion via some additional sources. I try to explain what tribes were here and what happened to them in terms of treaties they may have signed and reservations they may have ended up on in, say, Ohio, for example, and how later on there were treaties and decisions made about them moving to Kansas or Oklahoma. Again, this is not a very clean history. There are certainly abuses and coercion going on in some of these instances. And I tried to trace out some examples of the decisions that were made. I think I point to the Miami Indians, for example, in Ohio as a test case or as an example of what happened to some of these tribes. And I also point people to books like Richard White's book, The Middle Ground, which again is very foundational. And I point them to books like Susan Sleeper Smith's book about Native American history in this era. I was just editing a chapter for a book that's coming out to commemorate the 10-year anniversary of the beginning of the Midwestern History Association. And the chapter is about Native American historiography in the Midwest. And there really is I mean, this probably is the strongest area in terms of historiography of Midwestern history, is the various tribes in this area. I finished recently this book by Pekka Hamalanian. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It's a Finnish name, but he just wrote a book, a big picture survey about the tribes and how they ended up where they ended up um, in the United States writ large. But he obviously gives a lot of attention to the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley. And it's, I'm no expert in this field in particular, but it seemed to be very well done and offers a very nice big picture account of those early years of Native American history.
Yeah, and so so if that was how you approached Native American history, I know we had some questions from both in the chat here, but also earlier about your approach then to European settlement and how to balance. I know, especially my own background is in European immigration history, Dutch in particular. But how did you balance those stories, especially given the diverse groups of people that made their way here?
Well, I do try and emphasize the migration streams into the Midwest because, I mean, this is one of the key characteristics of the Midwest is its diversity in terms of migration streams, because you have upland Southerners moving in, you have Scotch Irish moving in, you have Yankees moving in from New England, you have Pennsylvania Quakers, you have Pennsylvania Dutch or Germans, and then you have a large group of foreign immigrants, as you mentioned. Dutch were part of that, but bigger groups would be foreign-born Germans and Scandinavians and Irish. And, the Germans were divided into Catholics and Protestants. So it's, in the early 19th century, Ohio was the most diverse state in the country because it has so many different groups of people from so many different places. And I try and highlight that in the book. Again, it's a complex topic, and there's kind of uneven distribution of these migration streams. You can use your example, you can follow the Dutch from New York to Western Michigan to Iowa into South Dakota, but you can do similar things with the Germans, who, I mean, this is the German heartland, the Midwest. The most German immigrants came to the Midwest, and it became the most German-leaning region in the country. And majority German counties in places in Minnesota and the Dakotas and Wisconsin, probably more than anyone. Kathleen Konzen's famous book about German Milwaukee. If anybody's interested in this, they should read it. And then, of course, the Scandinavians have a huge impact on, Decorah, Iowa, for example. Of course, Minnesota is heavily Scandinavian, so is the Dakotas. I just got a book to review by University of Minnesota Press about Scandinavian Minneapolis, which, this is the old Garrison Keillor jokes about Norwegian bachelor farmers. The jokes aren't just made up out of thin air. It represents a definite migration stream. So I try to emphasize that within the parameters set up by the book. Again, lots more could be said, and I try to point people to additional sources if they're interested in them.
Yeah, that's great. I think, again, back to the end notes, it's always good to dive in, and you're always good at pointing people to more reading. So we've got 1 minute left, and I want to end with the question that we try to end with everyone, which is just, what are you working on now? What's next? We've only got a short time, but in the last minute or so, what are you working on? What can people find and look forward to?
Well, there's a couple of projects that are currently in the hopper. I am editing a very large book on the history of the Midwest for Oxford University Press, which is 40 plus chapters, including one by Andrew Klumpp here, our host this evening. I am trying, as I mentioned to you, I've got books coming out on the Western side of the Midwest and the northern side of the Midwest. Well, I'm trying to finish this book on the eastern edge of the Midwest. We're pretty far along, but there's still some more work to do. But that's in progress. And then for the 10th anniversary of the Midwestern History Association, trying to finish up editing a book of essays about where the field stands. How are we doing? Have we revived the field? Are we still in the doldrums? What steps do we need to take? You're a historian, Andrew. We love these kind of state of the fields. Take the temperature of the field. What are the hot areas? What are the big questions? These are the kind of books that keep the field lively and strong and going. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm at the moment.
Yeah. So lots more to read. People can look forward to, if you like the conversation tonight and you get through the back catalog, you can look forward to brand new things rolling off the presses. And with that, I want to. That's all the time we have for tonight's book club. I think we can all agree this has been really informative, wide-ranging, talking about Iowa, but also Iowa's place in the region. So I want to thank everyone who's joined us this evening for your questions. A big thank you to Jon for making time to join us from South Dakota. I know on opening day for baseball, so you can run off and catch up on what's going on. We know I always love when we get to talk to people that I get to work with and I admire and whose work I've read. So it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for all that you do in taking the time tonight. We hope that everyone will sign up for our next book club, which is going to take place in May. It promises to also be a fascinating conversation. We'll be talking with Iowa historian Bill Fredericks about his new book, Saved by Schindler, which follows the story of a woman who was saved by Schindler during the Holocaust and then moved to Iowa and lived the rest of her life here. So an Iowan who landed in here after the Holocaust. You can look for registration and our full schedule on our website at iowaculture.gov. Feel free to register for future webinars in our series and look for more programs as well. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us today, and everyone have a great evening. Take care.